Recording in progress.
Calling this special meeting to order on Monday, December 4th. Our first item for discussion is the Educational Master Plan and the Facilities Master Plan update. Thank you, Dr. Richmond.
Chair Rial, members of the board, Chancellor Duran said, colleagues and guests, it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon with Brandy Delana to share an update about the EMP FMP Master Plan. So give me just a moment, I'll get my screen shared. There we go. All right, so what we're going to do today is provide a very brief update on the planning process through which the EMP and FMP were developed, and then walk you through all of the recommendations that were adopted by the executive leadership team around about 10 years ago now, a little under that. And we'll provide an update on the status of each one. We'll also share some performance data for some example programs. So the EMP and FMP were developed in consultation with external consultants through a process that involved data analysis, stakeholder input, and much more. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the details for each of the development processes, but what I will highlight is the stakeholder engagement that was involved through every step of the process. So here you can see conversations with key groups at the college for the development of the Education Master Plan, or EMP. There was also data collection, research and analysis, and then further campus engagement in the development of the initial draft plan that was then reviewed with key stakeholders. For the Facilities Master Plan, or FMP, it was a somewhat similar topic. So the consultants conducted a site visit, met with key individuals, analyzed detailed information, particularly around student location and enrollment trends, for example, and then ultimately developed a draft FMP for review by the college community. Taking the EMP and FMP that were developed and finalized by the consultants, the executive leadership team conducted a review of all the recommendations and developed specific priorities of what the college would implement and when, chunked into 3-year blocks. Now, a central theme within the recommendations within the plan was the development or creation of centers of excellence. Now, the slide that you see here summarizes some of the key aspects of a center of excellence. There's a couple key things that I want to highlight here. First, while we often talk about COEs and immediately think of facilities, having top-notch facilities is a key aspect, but really a COE is about having a good quality curriculum and academic offerings, be it through formal degree or certificate programs, or building in flexibility through short-term training opportunities. And it's also about being strongly connected with the local community. This could include local business, industry, workforce development, and area school districts. And it's very specific that these centers should focus on in-demand areas within the local community. I would also highlight that these centers should demonstrate high success rates, which is very much in keeping with our mission to transform lives through affordable education. So to be as open as possible, what we're going to do during the course of this presentation is step through each of the recommendations that were selected by ELT and summarize the current progress. Towards the end, we'll also share some metrics to show what the progress looks like in terms of student access and progress. As a note, when we first identified these priorities as a college, it was identified that the timeline may change to accommodate unforeseen circumstances. Keep in mind, this plan was developed in around about 2016, and a lot has happened between then and now. So some things proceeded on schedule, some things were moved around a little bit, and you'll see about those as we proceed today. So a few things were identified to occur in spring 2017, so we'll start there. The first planned activity was to enhance the program review process. Now, the work here has been led through academics, currently under the leadership of Wendy Weeks, and a number of different things have happened. So the program review process has been redesigned and built into an assessment system called eLumen. There's also, as another example, stackable credentials are now considered in one review rather than separately, which means it's a more integrated review process of closely related stackable credentials. Also embracing continuous improvement, feedback is gathered annually to find ways to improve the process as we move forward into the future. Spring 2017 was also the semester when we started the development of academic pathways. Now, a number of key milestones have been completed. There's also some work still underway. Among the things that were completed, we have a few examples here. Scheduling changes were implemented. The deans were also charged with creating areas of interest and providing examples of websites for display. This changed the way our programs are listed online. We have these areas of interest now, which make it much easier for students to navigate and find what they're interested in at the college. There's a variety of things that are still in the works for guided pathways. This is a huge initiative, and it's taken and will take a little more time to implement fully. Among the areas that are being addressed now are the development of a year-long course schedule, which is very beneficial for our students. So they have essentially a commitment from the institution for a year, right, around the schedule they can anticipate for the courses they're interested in taking. And our acting provost is currently leading a review of the current model and the status of the different components. Another one that was identified for spring 2017 was the development of utilization guidelines for instructional facilities. Now, a number of different things have been completed since this time. This, again, is an item under the leadership of academics. LaMarta Mitchell, when she was here, was the lead originally. And there's been a shift to scheduling personnel being centralized at the institution, which improves communication and is advantageous on a couple of different fronts. There's also been some business practices that have been standardized, like back-to-back scheduling and expansion beyond kind of like the prime time offerings between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., for example. We've also brought online software which has a room maximizer module that assigns classrooms based on instructional needs and enrollment caps, which again is to support efficiency in that scheduling process. And that system has built into it the guidelines of room utilization and capacity and things like that in alignment with the utilization guidelines that were intended through this initial activity. Now, if we move to the first 3-year chunk of time, this ran from July 2017 to June 2020. A number of these focused around centers of excellence, and the first of those is applied technology, which was implemented under the leadership of Greg Wilson and the downtown campus leadership team and their associated faculty, staff, and personnel. The Automotive Technology and Innovation Center opened in 2021 and is a facility I'm sure you will hopefully have the opportunity to visit. The Advanced Manufacturing Center is newer. This opened in 2023. Just to highlight a couple of things going on there, is hosted contract training for several cohorts of Raytheon employees. And also the welding schedule has been revised, so concurrently enrolled JTED students can earn our basic welding certification when they graduate from high school. And this one is a particularly good one to note when I mentioned before that COEs are intended to connect closely with the community we serve, and that last one is one example of that, as actually is the Raytheon example too. There was also a focus back in when these recommendations went into effect to expand investment in online educational services. A lot of work was done in this area, and it actually proved very advantageous for the college when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, because we were much better placed to handle that than we may have been otherwise. A few examples are listed here. I won't mention all of them, but just as a couple of examples, Pima Online adopted online tutoring services through NetTutor, which provided 24/7 online tutoring in a variety of subjects. And also the college redistributed 10 vacant positions to Pima Online to support the growing enrollment in online learning. Now, there are a couple of other things mentioned here on the slide, and there's actually a fairly sizable list of different things that were undertaken by the college through Michael Amick's leadership. And I would note here, and for any of these other items we'll talk about today, if the board would like more information is available, and we would be happy to share that with the governing board. Also during this year, we began relocation of other programs to new sites as needed to establish the centers of excellence. Now, for a number of the early centers, there wasn't much relocation required, but a lot of the relocations primarily focused around the closure of community campus, moving those functions to different sites across the district. The next planned activity was the establishment of a Center of Excellence in Public Safety and Emergency Services at the East Campus. Now, this is one that was not completed on schedule, but the work is underway now, and there will be town halls held at the East Campus. I believe those are scheduled for the spring to support that conversation as plans are drawn up and recommendations for next steps around PSCSI. Also, we had the establishment of a Center of Excellence in Computer Science at the East Campus. This is being led by Dean Jim Craig and the East Campus team. And the center opened in 2021. And there are a number of updates I could share about this location, but one is it was designated as a Center of Academic Excellence in Cyber Defense by the National Security Agency. And it also has extensive community engagement work underway there, and a few examples are listed here for you. The next of the planned activities related to the aviation program. Now, the expanded center opened in October 2022, and this one offers a non-destructive testing pathway, and we've been able to increase the number of cohorts in airframe and power plant. We have curriculum underway for an unmanned aircraft systems program as well, funded in this case by a donation from the Brown Family Foundation. And this is work led by Dean Greg Wilson, Jason Bowerstock, and the team at the Aviation Center. Next, we have the establishment of outreach centers. So to follow up on this item, a committee was formed to analyze how we might convert the adult learning centers into outreach community engagement centers. A number of the resultant recommendations have been followed up on as listed here, but this isn't something that was ultimately prioritized and moved forward in as a significant undertaking from this early period within the EMP and FMP. Also, again, in 2017-2020, there was work underway to implement the recommendations identified by the consultants associated with adult education. Now, as it currently stands, adult education is integrated into workforce development and innovation, and iBest and other programs continue to expand. So a lot of work has gone on in this area, and I would say that the world is very different now for adult education in terms of integration into the institution compared to where it was back in 2015, 2016. Though I think hopefully Laurie is there, and if you have any questions related to that, Laura, Kirsten, Joseph, or members of the team, I'm sure would be happy to respond. And of course, they took the lead on this undertaking for the college. And with that, we come to the end of the recommendations in 2017 through 2020. And I'm going to hand you over to Brandy Delana, who will speak about the other items.
Good? No, now you can. Okay, great. So Nick discussed the formative years from 2015 to 2017, and then led us through the progress that was made 2017 to 2020. I'll discuss the years 2020 to 2026, discussing objectives currently underway and others that are under consideration. So the objectives for the Center of Excellence in the health professions were to first identify funding, then to identify which programs would move over to West Campus. After that, then develop industry credentials, and then to remodel facilities to accommodate the program needs. Before I go on, I thought you'd like to know, and I think Nick alluded to it as well, that the leaders for the Center of Excellence programs are all sitting on the, they're here with us tonight virtually, and they'll be able to answer any questions you might have about the programs after the presentation. But to give you a little taste of the great things that are going on, we're listing 3 of the stackable credentials that are available through the health professions here on this slide. Next slide. I'm very excited to present the next slide, which represents the physical manifestation of all of the planning that's gone on over the years. So these pictures on the far left share the demolition of the existing space, the first 2 that you see. In the middle top, it demonstrates what we mean when we say demo down to studs. It's literally down to studs. The one below that is showing how there's framing going in to address the new programs. And then the 2 on the right identify where the location is for the new building. You see both the location and the completed foundation work. So let's move over to the Desert Vista, and that's our next Center of Excellence for Culinary, Hospitality, and Tourism Leadership. So next slide. So beginning this semester, the culinary students are engaging with their educators using the new Desert Vista culinary facilities. When I think about these credentials that are listed here, it makes me hungry just thinking about all the treats that come from these dedicated professionals. But it's more than that here in Tucson, isn't it? One way that Tucson celebrates our heritage is through food. Here's a quote from Visit Tucson webpage. Our food tells a story that dates back 4,000 years and represents a tapestry of Mexican and Native American traditions. This emphasis on Tucson's history is what we're tapping into when we support the culinary, the hospitality, and the tourism portion of the Centers of Excellence. The hospitality and the tourism portion is currently under construction over at Desert Vista. The next Center of Excellence that we'll discuss is the Center of Excellence Applied Digital Art and Design, which is also referred to as the Center of Excellence for Fine Arts. When I spoke with Dana Rose, your Dean of Arts, I was amazed by all that she's involved in. So my question to her was, can you share what progress has been made relative to expanding pathways and workforce connections? Her answer included an incredible list of progress in a variety of directions, including developing pathways with the University of Arizona in fashion, design, visual arts, musical and technical theater programs. She's also developing pathways with the high schools. Over at Sunnyside High School, there's a connection with our mariachi band. At Tucson High, there is a connection with Ballet Folklorico. And then there are other dual enrollment programs at 8 different high schools. And then, in relationship to the state's initiative, Film in Arizona, Dana Rose and Ian Rourke are beginning to develop industry connections, both with the film industry and with the Arizona Commerce Authority. So next slide. Now we're moving into 2023-2026. This slide represents remaining efforts underway, beginning with relocation considerations. So when Allied Health, the Center of Excellence Allied Health Facility is renovated, some of the programs will move over to West Campus from other campuses. Earlier, Nick mentioned the town halls that are underway with regard to Public Safety Emergency Services Institute, the PSCSI, and the proposed relocation from 29th Street over to East Campus, another relocation. And then the last thing we'll talk about today is relative to the planning are the other Center of Excellence program currently in the early stages of development is science and engineering. As with the other Centers of Excellence program development, the first steps include focus groups and community forums. Science and engineering held their first community forum this year in March. It included 22 students and 30 different business, industry, and education partners. So that wraps up 2020-2026 recap. And with that, I'm going to turn you back over to Nick, who will discuss effectiveness.
Great. Thank you, Brandy. So let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the changes and the new centers of excellence. Now, there are several ways we can consider the effectiveness of these sites and programs. We can look at their impact on key metrics, including enrollment, progress, and outcomes, and also look at community satisfaction. For our purposes today, we're going to focus on headcount, enrollment, and progress. And the reason for that is some of these centers are still relatively new, so it's hard for us to assess the impact on outcomes, but we certainly do have the opportunity now to look at headcount, enrollment, and progress to see what impact we have on metrics there. Now, if we look first at some of the college-wide trends, so here we have the enrollment trend at the institution by semester. So fall is shown in blue, spring in green, summer in orange over the last number of years now. We're all very familiar with the trend here. We were experiencing declines. It flattened off. Then the pandemic hit, and we lost more enrollment and headcount then as well. The centers were coming a lot online towards this right-hand end of this chart. We can also look at some of our institutional metrics as identified from the voluntary framework of accountability, which you see here. As a brief reminder, this is where we identify new students and track them for 2 years to see what happens to them. There are 2 metrics I'm going to refer to a little bit later. The first is a blue line across the top, which is fall to next term retention. So the proportion of those new students who are still in classes in the spring after they start. And you'll notice that while it was a little lower in fall 2014 and a little higher in fall 2019, it's otherwise been essentially flat for the institution during this time period. The other important line is the green one towards the lower end. This is no first term, no success. So these are students who in their first term do not pass any of their classes. Now we want this number to be as low as possible. Now we were at about 19% for those students starting in fall 2014, and for those starting in fall 2021, we're at about 21%. It dropped a little bit, but then it picked back up again. So we're essentially the same now as we were back in fall 2014. Now, initially, this doesn't seem overly encouraging for the institution. However, what we need to do when we think about the centers is not look institution-wide, but look at the specific programs to see how their metrics look. Now, we're just going to look at two examples in the interest of time for the session today, but if the board would like to see data on the other programs as well, we are able to provide that information. So what you can see here is example data for aviation technology and cybersecurity. So aviation is obviously a program that's been offered by the college for a while. So you can see the blue bars here for the academic year ending enrollment 2019. And we're showing the head count along the axis along the side here. And you can see that enrollment has been increasing within aviation since the 2021 year. So we see it's going up, most notably in the most recent year. Cybersecurity is a new area for the institution, but you can see that we have really healthy enrollment numbers, or headcount numbers, I should say, and they've been increasing every year. There's nothing in these data that indicates these programs are maxing out in terms of their headcount. And these are really encouraging numbers and really encouraging trends. And note how they look really quite different from what we see when we look at the full institution. So this indicates that these are very healthy programs bringing in enrollment increases for the institution. We can also look at persistence. So it's labeled persistence here, but this is those students who start in the fall who are still taking classes in the spring. Now, for aviation technology, the numbers are above 75%. They're in the 80% range. For cybersecurity, they were just under 75%. But each of these bars corresponds to a different cohort year, and note how that is increasing. And so that's way up in the high 80% now. For comparison purposes, if we look at an equivalent group of students, but for the full institution, our persistence rate is around about 66.5%. So the persistence rates in these programs are significantly higher than the ones we see when we look at the full college community. And again, this highlights the quality of these programs and that they are successful in keeping the students at the college and progressing towards their educational goals. So the centers are clearly important, and a lot of work has been done by a lot of people. And as Brandy noted, many of the people directly involved in this work, and it has been a lot of work, are in the room with the board this evening. And I would miss people if I tried to list them all. But Greg Wilson, Amanda Abens, Jim Craig, and others have been directly involved in these centers across the different areas, Dana Rose, and others. It's a huge long list, and a huge amount of work has gone into these centers by those people, facilities, IT, many other people at the college. We see positive access measures as we see through headcount and enrollment increases, and we see very positive progress metrics as we see through the persistence rates we looked at on the previous slide. These are all huge positives and a testament to the hard work by a huge number of people at the college. Now, as we start transitioning and thinking about our next education and facilities master planning cycle, which will connect into strategic planning this go around, we need to build on our centers and build on our successes with the centers, and also address the reality that some of our key metrics, such as enrollment, first term no success, and others have stayed relatively flat for the college as a whole. They have increased for the centers, but they have not increased outside of those areas for the most part. So if we're to live our purpose of transforming lives through affordable education, we need to think about how we do business for the other students we serve so we can support their success as well. Just as a couple of examples, please note the y-axis on these charts are different scales, but they're in the same size to highlight the difference. We know, for example, that 2/3 roughly of our learners are part-time, and their progress and outcomes are typically lower than full-time students. Their first term no success is much higher than our full-time students, and their retention is much lower than our full-time students. We need to think about what that means when we're talking about the majority of the students we serve. In addition, we know for other measures, in this case, we're looking at first term no success, that there is a variation when we look across diverse student populations. For this particular metric, 1 in 5 of our students do not see any success in their first term. That increases to about 1 in 3 of our Black or African American students. For our American Indian or Alaska Native students, it's about 1 in 4. So as we work to support equity and social justice, we need to reflect deeply on these numbers and what they mean and what we can do as an institution to support the success of all of our students.
Excuse me, Dr.
So
Richmond.
for next step, oh, of course, please
Will
go
you
ahead.
just go back to that prior slide and tell me once more, is it, you're showing no success, that's what this slide is?
Yes, and I apologize. I realized I missed the title off this
Okay,
one.
thank you.
This
I
is
just wanted to
showing
make sure
first
that's
term-
what it was. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So my apologies about that, but this is first term no success. So as we talk about next steps around planning in general, the EMP and FMP specifically, we're currently in the process of extending the strategic plan by 1 year, weaving into that a full consideration of equity and social justice. And then we'll be conducting our first fully integrated planning process in 24-26. This will include analysis of key metrics, extensive benchmarking, and also a review of recommendations we received about for the mid-cycle of the EMP FMP from the external consultants. We'll conduct an ongoing analysis of the effectiveness of the changes under the current EMP and FMP to ensure that we are seeing ongoing positives for the institution and to consider continuous improvement. And we need to address funding for projects in the pipeline. And that key piece, I'm going to hand you back over to Brandy to speak about that one.
That before. Okay, here we go. We're about to turn this over to Dr. David B. to discuss budgets with you, but before we go, we want to share current project funding status. So here's a list of projects that are underway with funding information. You can see that for projects on this list, some have received funding previously and all have received funding during this fiscal year allocation. The outstanding funding column demonstrates a need of $20.3 million for the West Campus Health Professions renovation, with $16.2 million projected and based on anticipated construction completion for this fiscal year. And then $4.1 million is anticipated to be billed during fiscal year 25. All other projects shown here are fully allocated. So next slide. And like Nick's, I apologize for the title. This one should say underfunded and unfunded projects. So lastly, here's a list of projects that are either in the unfunded or underfunded status. As noticed at the top of this presentation, Nick mentioned this earlier, long-term timelines are designed with the understanding and expectation of change and depend on available financing, staffing resources, and meeting changing needs. With that, we're open to your questions, or if you want to hold them until after Dr. B's presentation, we'll all be available then also.
I have two questions, one about cybersecurity and then one about health professions. For cybersecurity, I know, Nick, you had said that, and forgive me, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but that though the cybersecurity program wasn't at capacity or wasn't nearing capacity or something to that extent, I had been reached out to by a number of business professionals that were in cybersecurity, and I ended up hearing from one of the members of Tucson City Council that were concerned. I don't know where they're being told this or where they're getting their information from, but that there was more demand for the cybersecurity program than we could fulfill, and so students were being turned away, that they weren't able to find the classes that they were trying to get into, and that we were trying to hire more. But I'm curious if anyone of the folks on the call or folks could address that. I mean, are we seeing more demand than what we're able to fulfill, and what's the plan to make sure we're able to meet that demand so we're not turning away enrollment?
It looks like our Dean, Jim Craig, Cybersecurity and IT and Hospitality, is going to answer the question, but we do have a high demand for cybersecurity.
Thank you. Yeah, the demand for IT cybersecurity is huge. So just from 2018 to summer of 2023, we've had an increase of 547 enrollments. So we're over 4,600 enrollments now, but our number of full-time faculty have remained relatively the same. And the facility for the Center of Excellence for IT and Cybersecurity is the pilot or the initial build is complete, but it's only 11,000 square feet. For 4,600 enrollments, that's not, not a very big facility. So we're taking steps now because we do have an extensive waiting list. We did turn away students in the fall, and we're going to be turning away students in the spring as well. And that has to do with a lack of full-time faculty and essentially an exhaustion of recruiting part-time or adjunct faculty. And so that's the good problem that we're facing, and it's just difficult for us to build it up fast enough to meet the demand. But that's what we're doing. The current faculty allocation process that was done college-wide identified a need for about 7 additional full-time faculty. We immediately have 2 given to the program, so we're in the process of recruiting for those and converting 1 provisional to a full-time. So that's the steps we're taking to start to augment and try to address the demand and the need.
So in terms of the barrier for bringing those additional faculty in, is it that there's just a dearth of them and it's hard to find them, or is it that we're not paying competitively to get them, or like what's the barrier to getting up to where we need to be to not have to turn people away?
Well, allocating the positions is one. We need to allocate that many positions. And then there is a barrier to recruiting successfully because of the pay demand. Even if somebody wants to give back, get into education and give back, you're taking typically somebody that's making not a low 6-figure income, but significantly higher than that, that's going to be qualified to teach our courses. So that's the challenge with recruiting the full-time faculty is as a matter of fact, most of our recruitments need to be 12-month faculty positions just so we can get that salary to a little bit more competitive level so we can attract the right people to the program.
So it seems, and maybe this is a Dave question for later or a follow-up question, but like there's some economics there, right? Because those students that we're turning away would be paying tuition. So at some point, and maybe we're at the sweet spot, so don't get me, I'm not saying that we are, but it seems like at some point it's like just offer to pay more because you'd get the enrollment and then that would pay for what so if we're like waiting around for something, if we know that there's all this pent-up demand, I'm trying to reconcile it in my head. It just seems like I would be curious to know, it doesn't have to be right this second, but like why aren't we moving faster to do that? And is there something we could do to move faster? Because certainly it's been one of all of our goals that we've articulated, the chancellors and others, to boost enrollment. So it pains me a little bit to know that we're turning away students for something that that they want. And I should have said before, and forgive me that I didn't, that all those folks that reached out to me loved the cybersecurity program. That's why they were reaching out, and they were saying, this program is awesome, we want to get more students in it. How can we facilitate that to be able to get more students in it? So while they did have a complaint, I suppose, they were very complimentary in terms of the program overall. So thank you for you and everyone else that's been involved in it.
You're welcome.
Also, if I could add, so just to reiterate what Jim said about, we have 2 faculty who are in the process of being recruited, and I'm sure we'll be looking at others. So especially if they're retirements, that'll be the first thing that we'll be looking at.
Great. And I do have a question about healthcare, but if any of my colleagues up here want to have questions for Jim about cybersecurity, go ahead and then I can jump in there.
I just want to make a comment real quick. I've always been an advocate. If there are more than 16 students in a class, it's paying the adjunct faculty salary. So, you know, I'm agreeing with you. If there is the need,
let's get them staffed so we can have the classes. Let's not turn students away. And that's not only in this area, but it's in every area, right? If someone wants to take a, high-level math class and there's not a high-level math class offered at one of the campuses, that's a mistake that we're making.
Yeah, for sure. Anyone else have cybersecurity or okay. So healthcare professions. I'm just curious, can you give me, even if it's at a high level, the timeline for like when it's going to launch? And because I know we had some pieces that were there and some pieces that were moving, and I seem to recall, and those were conversations I think I had with Chancellor Lambert a long time ago, so that it was on pace to open next year, but I don't have anything more firm in my head than next year. So any other timeline information you can give me about when that's all fully coming online would be great.
Of this year, we're expecting construction to be complete. Then we'll have some time needed to install furniture and IT. And so we're looking at a spring start.
Yeah. And I just came from there. That's where I was before with Senator Kelly's staff. And we took a tour of it, and that's what they said, October 31st. And then they'll be starting with the furniture. So it's coming along very nicely, very quickly.
I don't have anything for you. I have some questions, but I think they're more for Dr. Richmond. Okay, so a couple, you don't have to answer them now. Maybe if you could just send them later. But the cohort training, how many students went through the program is what I'd like to know. The Pima online tutoring, have you guys identified what areas of tutoring are needed? What's the one that's requested the most, and are we serving the students? I know it's 24 hours, but I do know somebody that's doing the tutoring, so I'm just curious to know. And my reason for asking that question is that even with a 25% not completing or continuing on, that's a huge number. And I think we just need to understand what that is. Well, I guess he's going to answer it. Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So our Vice President of Pima Online is Michael Amick is going to answer.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you again for the question about online tutoring. We actually have two methods for online tutoring at the college. One is virtual tutoring sessions through our centers across the college that if a student can't come to campus and they want to work with a tutor from Pima College, they can do that during regular business hours. And that came into place because of the pandemic. Those centers really started offering those virtual sessions, and they persist. And I don't supervise that area, but Ed Gallagher has all that information about what type of sessions. The company that we utilize for 24/7, 365-day-a-year tutoring is called Net Tutor, and they have every subject possible with an instructor that teaches in that. And by far, the most requests that they have for tutoring is in writing, and they have a completely virtual center to help with writing, and whether that's thesis or subject area. And then the second main area for tutoring demand is in mathematics. So those are the two main subjects. And we do get a monthly report of the utilization, and we promote it in our virtual environment so that students understand it's a free service to them for their success. The faculty also point and guide them to that, as well as our success coaches, so that they know that option is there to help them with whatever questions they have for tutoring. If that helps answer your question.
Thank you. Then I had, okay, I guess it was also on, maybe this is, I'm going to not go for that one. Okay. When on page 14 it says CC, is that community college, the community campuses? Is that what that's referring to?
Yes, that's correct. That was community campus.
Okay. And then there was page, okay, on page 17, the unmanned aircraft system. I don't think it's really for you. I should have asked that with you. Why was the decision made to offer a course in unmanned vehicle? Was there a demand by the community to have that? And then the outreach community engagement centers, what does that consist of? How are we utilizing that? Like I said, I don't think all of these are for you, Dr. Richmond.
So I think that would be Dean Greg Wilson. He can address those questions.
Good afternoon. Yes, when we were preparing the Brown Foundation proposal, part of asking for the funding to develop the drone program was because we had been asked by industry partners, hey, we need this skill set. And then also part of our partnership with JTED, they had started a program previously. If you've seen what they have, it's more focused on sometimes what you see on ESPN when they're going through abandoned buildings, and we were looking more for law enforcement, agriculture,
No, it's a good thing.
construction.
Yeah. I just wondered, where you guys came up with that idea. So no, that's great. Let me see. So the other thing, I know that we're looking at the enrollment to see, and I think Dr. Richmond, you guys made a really good point that we need to evaluate the enrollment. And, what are the reasons for people not continuing? That's really important because, there's got to be a reason from once. I would expect, in my view, that if people are registering in the fall, then more than likely they would continue to the next semester, but that's not happening in some cases. And I know it's 20%, 25%, still a large number. So, okay, let me see. No, I think I'm done, but thank you so much for the information. I like, I like the presentation, I like the numbers that were given. So thank you.
Nick, I have a couple of questions also, and once again, you don't have to answer them now. Just if you could get back to us, that would be great. On one of the slides, it said that pharmacy tech moved from the community campus to the West Campus. And I remember when I used to teach at the East Campus, it was there. Not that the location matters, but I thought that that program was discontinued. So I'm just wondering, do we still have a pharmacy tech program? And if not, maybe with the new Center of Excellence, we should reenact that if there's a need for it. I know that the comment that I heard from pharmacists that I know is that, they were paying a lot of money to get the pharm tech degree, and then the salaries for technicians was relatively low. It was minimum wage for a long time there, and it still may be actually. The next question was, on one of your slides, you had the 4 strands of guided pathways from the American Association of Community Colleges. Will you just forward that to me sometime? What are those strands? What does that mean? I don't know much about guided pathways, and I was a college employee, so maybe that's something, if you could just do a quick one-pager for all of us so we understand what that means, that would be lovely. And then the other thing I've mentioned before in board meetings, and I know it's not our place to dictate what you all do, but I definitely believe that if we could survey students at the beginning of each semester and ask them what are their plans next semester, what classes do you want, where do you want to take them, what are the times you can take them at, those sorts of things, I think we might have a better understanding of what students need. Because I'm going to agree with Maria, if somebody's starting out in the fall, my guess is their plan is to continue, but they don't for some reason. And if we could, ameliorate any of the reasons that it's, it's on us that they don't continue, that would be extremely beneficial. So I'm not sure if that's something that you could think about with your group and any of the other ELT people to see if that's at all a possibility. But I think asking students what they need is I think it could be profitable, both in, head count and tuition, and it would be profitable for them because they'd be able to get the classes that they need at the campus they need for the next semester. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you both for the questions. I made note. I'll follow up on all of the items that weren't addressed in the room. Chair Rial, if I may comment about your suggestion around the survey. We can look into doing something like that, but as we progress with guided pathways, we're actually going to know the courses a student will need based on the pathway they're in, We've also been evaluating tools we might use where we can leverage machine learning and AI to predict for us the schedule that we need to build based on the students who are at the institution and likely classes or most common classes that new students tend to take. So we may be able to go to the survey route, but we may be able to automate this leveraging technology and the information through pathways. So we'll look into it and we will provide an update to the board.
So with the new and expanded programs that are realizing an increase in enrollment and understanding that our enrollment is relatively flat, or what am I trying to remember, 3%-ish? Are we looking at where the enrollment is dipping? We're looking at pumping money into the new programs, but is there not someplace else that we need to transfer funds from the places that are losing enrollment to the new programs and modified programs that are increasing enrollment? And is that not part of this entire conversation?
That's a great question. And that is part of the conversation that's underway. Within the interim chancellor's goals, we have a sub-goal that's seeking to identify ways that we can save. The estimate is the target for the goal about $2 million a year. One of the things we're looking at are efficiencies related to academic offerings. There are a number of different aspects of that, but those the analysis of that will be complete by the end of this month, and then those items will move forward for discussion by college leadership, and then forward to Dr. David B. for part of the budget discussion and the three-year budget planning. So things related to academic efficiencies looks both at how we can be more efficient within, for example, our course offerings, but also where there's potential to stop doing things where there isn't enrollment, or maybe there aren't the outcomes, or there isn't a demand in the local community for the programs that we're offering, to see where we might leverage savings in one area that we can then reassign out to support these growth areas.
But to me, the snapshots of the enrollment in different programs is the ultimate student survey. If they're telling us I'm not going to take this course or this pathway, that's a survey. And we should be very sensitive to that. So if students aren't seeing it as a benefit to them, then why are we offering it? That's part of one question. And then the other is, at what point in this process of looking at facility improvement or expansion do we actually start assigning potential dollar amounts? In this whole long process you started back in 2017, we didn't see, at this point in time, cost estimates are being implemented. And to take that a step further, and you can maybe answer this later, when I'm looking at the projects prioritized, every single category has college reserves as part of the funding. And I'm going to need to know what college reserves are, how much is in there, and don't call the U of A and ask for their advice. But if we're using college reserves for the funding categories, and are we doing a one-time expenditure? And right now we have seven prioritized projects. And then if you flip the slides a little bit, there's going to be more in the future. And at what point in time do we run out of those reserves, and how are they being replenished? Grants are good, but the reserves are coming out of, at one time, the budget, being transferred into reserves. And then part of that conversation is going to be the revenue bonds. And what does the future look like for revenue bonds? And what does that mean to the budget as it pertains to taxing? Thank you.
Board Vice Chair, Dave is going to be addressing that. So this was kind of like the background contextual information, and now we're going to be doing a deeper dive that will hopefully address your questions.
So it would be interesting to see a presentation like this, where these are our new dreams, and these are the old dreams that aren't fulfilled. And at the same time, it's like a positive budget impact and a negative budget impact. and it all comes out of the same budget. Thank you.
And then Brandy, I have one more question on that second to the last slide where they, number 4, the Catholic Community Service demolition and parking. Do we know what would be the ramifications if we just held off on that? I mean, is that like a huge liability to have a building that we're not going to utilize because it's not necessarily workable for us? So I'm seeing everything else on there. We have to do that. We have to do that. Well, I don't know. Do we have to do the demolition?
Given the costs that are identified for the demolition, if we look at another example of a building that's not occupied on the downtown campus, we are spending a lot of money on maintenance, keeping people from breaking in. There's always the potential for fire. The police services are taxed higher at a higher rate to have to keep that I'm talking about the Drachma properties, keep them safe. We would have 2 of those at the downtown campus. And so for that reason, I would encourage you to demolish that building. Also, not that there's a great need for it right now, but it would provide us with additional parking. Okay, you're welcome.
Board Chair, I had one correction to make regarding cybersecurity. It's actually 3 faculty that are being recruited right now, so we're doing a phased approach.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the budget planning with Dr. David B.? Thank you.
Thanks, Marcos. Good evening, or afternoon/evening. We'll get into the evening, I think. Chair Rial, members of the board, Chancellor Duran-Cerda, colleagues and guests. It's my pleasure to have the conversation today. I'm going to try and answer all the world's questions and solve all the world's problems, maybe, or at least we'll bring up some of the ones that are particularly perplexing. There are a lot of things that we're going to talk through today. I really want to leave some time at the end to get feedback from the board in the study sessions. It's an opportunity for us to get the feedback from you on what you want to see in the budget development process. So let's keep that in mind as we're going, that you're giving us feedback on things that you want to see or explore. This is the beginning of the upcoming budget cycle and the development of the upcoming 3-year plan. So it is your opportunity to give us feedback of what you want us to fold into that. Okay. Starting with the overarching parameters. Can you see the slide? Okay. I just wanted to make sure, since I'm seeing that it looks different. The budget process here is folding in a bunch of long-term planning that we just had conversations about, the education and facility master plans, things that have been identified, strategic plan, college goals. All of those things are sort of the premise that you're trying to get into the budget in any given year, along with other realities. So when you talk about the budget forecast and how this comes together, it's not only are you folding in long-term goals of the institution, you're talking about the capacity of the institution to do various things, talking about making sure that our budget model is a solid financial stewardship model. And so one of the things within the model is you want your operating expenses to be consistent with the realistic operating revenues, right? So your ongoing expenses need to be covered by your ongoing revenues. You preceded some of the conversation about the reserves, spending down reserves. Using reserves strategically to buy or pay for one-time expenses is a smart thing once you've built up your reserves a certain amount. You do not want to use reserves to basically facilitate deficit spending on operations. And we've had conversations related to that in the last couple of years. Again, so we'll talk a little bit about the metrics. Most of that I'm not going to get into much because we provide that information at the end. There are links that you can check on. We update that with the annual financial report that has a bunch of metrics in it. And then we have particular metrics that are looking at things that are particularly sensitive. We have that information on our website, and we have links to that always with the budget materials so that you can always click on that, look at that. One of the things that we do with those charts, there are about 9 charts that are pretty telling on where the college's financial situation is, particularly in terms of trends, is looking at things like personnel expenses versus enrollment, looking at personnel expenses as a total expenses. What you want to do is make sure that those things stay in a healthy balance. And so one of the things that we do, there's a little quick and dirty, if you click on those, you'll see there's a little arrow on one of the corners of those slides. The arrow is red, yellow, green. Hopefully that's pretty obvious what that means. If it's green, it's good. If it's red, it's bad. It's a concern. The arrow also will be going up, will be flat, or going down. If it's going down, that means it's getting worse, the trend. And this is a judgment call, but it's pretty straightforward stuff. If it's an arrow going down, it's getting worse. If it's flat, it's about the same. If it's an arrow going up, it's getting better. So a green arrow up is it's good already and it's getting better. A red going down is this is a problem or a concerning metric and it's getting worse. So that's a quick way to look at some of the key metrics. If you ever have questions about those, why they're the way they are, why they're changing the way they are, I will address a lot of those things during these conversations. You'll hear them in different ways, but if you ever have the questions, let me know. Again, and then we're going to spend some time talking about the outlook for next year, expenditure priorities, things that and they're going to be fairly straightforward, the priorities we're going to talk to you about. We've had some conversations already inside the college with ELT, and we've had some preliminary conversations with the AERC group to talk about, let's start drafting up and developing what our priorities are going to be for the budget, and then going along with that, what is the revenue outlook? Because remember, you have to match those things together. And again, as I mentioned, my main goal today is not only to provide you information, but to get feedback from you. I mentioned already a little bit about the stewardship metrics, but again, we take a lot of pride at this institution that we are running a solid financial operation, that we balance our revenues with our expenditures, that we strategically think things through and make smart decisions. You can't ever do all of the things that people want to do. There's an unlimited number of ideal, wonderful projects and programs that we could do. The reality is trying to balance with what our realistic revenue projections are going to be. I've talked a little bit about the different metrics. The other thing that we do, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the benchmarking throughout the budget process, there's different components where we compare ourselves not only for our own longitudinal basis, how are we doing in terms of longitudinal trends, how is the college changing, what are the concerns over time? I'm going to show you one of those in a second. But also, how do we compare to peer institutions, to our other institutions, and make sure, are we getting out of whack in terms of some of the ratios that we may have, that sort of thing. There are key metrics, and this is particularly in the financial reports, key metrics that go into our credit worthiness, and also that are provided to the HLC on an annual basis. So those metrics are financial health metrics. We track those very closely. They're in our annual financial report. We also have that information. We provide that to Finance Audit, and we have it on our website, along with information that explains what those metrics mean. Okay, I'm not going to get into this too much. It's in front of you. This is basically the outline of how the budget comes together on a given year. So we sort of give you a quick, how are things looking so far? What does the projection look? What are the priorities that we're thinking? This is the kickoff of that process, and then throughout the spring, and I know Board Member Taylor, you've asked this question many times. It seems like we're starting halfway through. Well, partly you were starting halfway through. Partly is that it's also a revolving, rolling process. And so it has annual finite points. You adopt the budget in June and you start up the next year, but you're also dealing with ongoing realities and commitments and things like that. And so it's sort of an ongoing, okay, what new strategic thing do we need to fold into the budget? How are we going to fold that in? How does that impact future years going forward? These are the key decision points. Some of them are very straightforward, We take tuition, the key ones to think about are we take tuition to the board in March. There's a reason we do it in March. Why is it in March? Because in April, we roll out the schedule for fall, and we don't want to change the tuition pricing when students can start to enroll in classes. So if you adopted tuition, you have the ability to increase tuition after that. What it would mean, though, is some students would have paid less than you're now charging, and we would have to go back, and that's bad practice. So that's why March is the tuition. That's why a lot of things then are dependent on like trying to get it up and running. How does everything look by March? Unfortunately, not everything works in that March timeframe. The state didn't decide what our operating budget was going to be until about June last year. So you're talking about different things happen at different times. Most of these things are, though, queued up for them to make logical, rational decisions so that we're not overcommitting, or we're not, we know what's coming. For us, 98% of the situation is pretty determined by the February, March timeframe. Okay, this is the one I was talking about, longitudinal. So what this is it's looking at employee compensation and benefits, and then other operating expenses. So the combination of those two, so blue plus orange on the columns, is your total expenses over a year. These are actual expenses. And then looking at over time how that compares with our enrollment. So obviously this is a concerning trend line where you have over the last number of years, and you saw that a few minutes ago in the previous presentation, enrollment declines, particularly starting back in 2013 is when it started declining. They stabilized for a little bit, and then we got hit hard with COVID. At the same time, expenditures are ramping up. So your expenditures are ramping up at the same time enrollments are declining. That's a concerning trend. That would be your red arrow going down. Right? This is not news. We've been talking about that for some time. We have metrics to track on that. Some of this also was planned and known. So know that the expenditures going up, you'll see it isn't just the compensation and benefits that were going up. Those actually increased significantly just the last year. It's that with the investments in the centers of excellence. So the expenditures that we're putting into building those buildings is why a lot of the expenses went up over the last few years when our enrollment was going down. Also expenses that the other quirky factor that was happening is the COVID relief money that came from the federal government increased dramatically our expenses and the revenues, right? We were just passing that money through, or we were receiving money to do good infrastructure investing. But the expenses went up as a result of that. So our enrollment was going down, but we got money to compensate for that. Nevertheless, this is a concerning trend. The other one is the class comp study and the dramatic increase that we put into compensation based on market-based salaries and wages. That has had a significant impact on our expenses overall. We knew it was happening, we were planning for it, and it was a known thing to do, but that is at the same time, that's coming at the same time that enrollments declined, right? So it's not that it's not for a good reason. It's not that you don't have to do it. It just is running against the other trend that you're tracking it against. Okay. Now this is the one, the trend the information that Board Member McLean was just referencing. And we provided the board recently a quick update in comparison with the University of Arizona. So it's pretty well documented right now. They have a financial challenge on their hands. They have a target, so their strategic reserve target is to have 140 days cash on hand, what's called cash on hand. What that represents is you take your operating expenses, or let me back up. You go back and you say, what are our reserves that we have on hand? So cash plus investments, and then you divide it by your prior year's expenses, and 365 days equal a year. So your expenses per year. So then you look at how much reserve capacity, what are your savings that you have on hand in comparison to your operating commitments, your operating expenses going on. And the days on hand is a sort of a proxy measure that's used by the credit agencies, and again, it's used by the Board of Regents to give you a proxy measure of how much savings you have on hand to cover your expenses. Okay, their target is 140 days. We have a board policy that's based on 75%. It's not exactly the same measure, but it's pretty close. And that's why I have the dots and the lines. So our board policy is the line. That's based on our budget for our general and designated funds, so our operating budgets, 75% of our operating budgets, and then the dots that don't have a line connecting them, that's more consistent with the days on cash on hand that the university uses. So you see it's a proxy measure. They're both close. Our policy is based on budget. I'm going to have a conversation with finance audit in the upcoming couple of months. Let's take a look. Should we change it to be that more traditional measure? There are pros and cons. The other one that I want to have a conversation with is, if you notice, the Board of Regents also has not only a low point, they have a high point. And then what that would do for us is, if we had a high point measure, it would say, if our reserves are getting above that point, let's strategically start planning to spend them down. Now, I will say, for all intents and purposes, that's exactly what we did do. We just didn't have a number that told us when to do that. So as you can see, our reserves, that's the columns, have grown in very healthy ways over the last number of years. And then the board made decisions to cash fund. So not only did we issue revenue bonds for some of these buildings, but we also did a couple of the building projects and supplemented the building projects by using reserves and essentially cash funding them, Allied Health being the most notable of them. So supplementing those revenue bond projects with the Centers of Excellence projects that we were working on, and now using some of the cash reserves that we built up over time. So this was planned, it was known, it was discussed that we would start spending that down. As you can see, indeed, our reserves are now spending down, and that number for next year, so for the year we're currently in, our reserves will then now be below our target number. I can tell you I'm expecting that to be the case. 2 points. Remember, our reserve threshold is 75%. 75% of 365 days is it's about 280 days. So the university's target is 140 days. Our target is 280 days. It's a very conservative number. Nevertheless, it's our number, and it's the one we want to track on. So when we go below that number, what does it trigger? So the board policy triggers, I need to talk with you about it. I need to show you that indeed we're below our target threshold number, and then we have to come up with a plan for how we're going to get back to it. It's not binding, it's not committing. The board can say, thank you, that's lovely, nice plan. We still don't want to increase tuition or something like that. But what it does is it triggers the conversation so that we have a very conservative, very healthy financial reserve on hand. The policy ensures that we will have that on hand. And then what it does is it makes sure that we will have that conversation and it's out in the open, that we're not deficit spending or creating some problem on a long-term basis. Okay, did that get to all of the questions, Dr. McLean, related to reserves and how we're spending it down? Okay, good. Yay, I won. On that point, I won. Okay, let's talk a little bit about expenditure priorities. So unromantically, a lot of our baseline expenditure priorities are basically acknowledging the fact that things get more expensive, and to keep doing what we're currently doing is sort of a starting point. So that's a lot of inflationary costs. Not per se, and not in the sense that there are many, we do not inflate operating expenses in the budget. We don't just go to people's budgets and say you get 3% more, or inflation is 10%, we're going to increase your operating budget by 10%. We don't do that. That would be from my standpoint, that would be a bad practice. What we do is if there are expenses that are known contractual obligations, those get folded into the budget. And so when we first start talking about what increases happen over a year that we have to factor in, those are the things like computer licensing expenses, system licensing expenses, utility expense increases, and compensation increases. Those are the things, or it's actually, before I get into compensation, let me put compensation and put that over to the side for a second. Benefits cost increases, so healthcare cost increases. I'm going to go through what those typically are in a given year, but those are the things that we go, okay, well, the first thing we need to do with the budget is we know some of these things are going to go up. We have to fold that in, and that doesn't do anything additional for anyone. And then the last part is some of the things that were just discussed, that we have strategic initiative money. We have things where we have programs get identified as that this looks like a good thing. We need to get into the business of doing that. If it requires additional funding, we have mechanisms to seed that, to start that up. But then if we do that, then we have to fold that in the budget. So some of those cost increases might be covering for, might be making up for the fact that we've covered them temporarily with the reserve, with the budgeted reserve. But then ultimately, if you're going to keep doing that program, you have to fold it into the regular budget. Also, if something comes up and you go, we need to do X now this next year, right? We have time. We want to start in fall. We want to start doing an X. Okay, then we have to actually start putting that into the budget. So that would be an add to what we're doing. Okay, now let's get to some of the uglier parts of the world, which is cost pressures that exist. Different things that pop up during the year. Things that we would like to do. I mentioned there's no shortage of ideal things that we would like to do. We have finite resources. That's one of the challenges. Childcare is a particular challenge. So we have a program that was supported partly by grants and partly by the college. The part that the college is supporting has gone up dramatically from what the initial estimates were going to be to support that program, to keep that programming going on an ongoing basis, and or if the grant ends, then the college to continue that kind of service, we have to factor that in. In addition, we had conversations about, and the newspaper reported, or I can't remember if it was the newspaper, but the city had a deficit on their hands related to transportation, and they were looking for some of the key employers in town, particularly TUSD, the U of A, and Pima, to help support keeping the ridership, the cost of riding free, which they started in COVID. Well, they want to keep that program going, and they were looking for us to pick up a very big part of that cost. So those kinds of pressures come up on an annual basis. If it makes sense, that's one thing. If it's something that's okay, that doesn't totally make sense. Another one that came up in the last board meeting was the idea of the college providing funding to build a bike path from St. Mary's Hospital to West Campus. Okay, that is not our property. It would be exceedingly expensive for us to support that, and it's not per se our problem. It's not that we don't want to have a safe bike lane for students. Of course, we would all want that. But that's the kind of thing that can pop up and that you have to think, okay, well, is that appropriate for the college to fund? Is that, and then we work obviously with our partners to try and make that not our expense, but that's the kind of thing that can come up. And again, there's no shortage of things that are nice that we would like to do, but we have to be balanced with what we can possibly do. Yeah.
Dr. E, I have a question. On the transportation, that did not come before the board.
That it didn't happen. So there were conversations, they wanted it to happen. It didn't happen. We're not funding it. That's an ongoing thing. If that were to be the case, if we did need to take on that kind of an expense, that would be included in the budget. And if there was a contractual element to it, it would come to the board. But it didn't happen. We have been working with the city, by the way. We have representatives. I and Libby are both on a committee talking with them about how to approach that issue. So we are working collaboratively on it. My goal is not to have additional costs come to the college related to that. I want to sort of shoot through these because I want to get to being able to give you some time. Co-curricular expenses are underfunded at the college. Primarily, that is athletics and the arts programs. The funding used to come, the idea for it years ago was that student services fee money would be sufficient to cover athletics. Because enrollment has dropped dramatically, the revenue that we used to get is much lower than what it used to be because it's based on $2.50 per credit hour. And the expenses for those programs, with the exception of that we did reduce expenses pretty dramatically, particularly when we eliminated the football program. But with the current programs that are in place, the expenses only grow in that area. So it was designed to be a cost center model, meaning that the revenues would offset the expenses. But the revenues it's unrealistic to expect that the revenues could offset the expenses for athletics the way that athletics is. That is a conversation that we need to have. But it is structurally underfunded to between $1 million and $2 million. So that's a starting point that we really want to talk about, trying to get that folded into the budget. I'm going to skip through some of these. One of the ongoing concerns is that we used to get a fair amount of money from bookstore revenues. That is the old way, the old model. Now we have a really good program here. We have a lot of open educational resources at the college. That's something that we like. So those are free texts for students. And also that there are a bunch of other texts where it is reducing the cost to students. The competition that the bookstore used to be, like students came to classes and they would get their books at the bookstore. That isn't the way that it works anymore, so they don't get the majority of students, either don't buy books or don't buy them through them. They'll go online for those textbooks. As a result, the money that we receive from bookstores has gone down dramatically over time. The money that they make has gone down. It's not that they're squeezing us. It's a combination. Their total revenues, they're not capturing the students. And then the money that we get as sort of a commission based on the sales has gone down dramatically as well. Shockingly, a lot. But I mean, it's happened gradually over time. It's not news, but we've been folding that in over time. One of the things that is happening in the bookstore business that you may hear something about in the next 6 months to a year is that bookstores, traditional college bookstores, are shifting more to the model of providing students their textbooks up front as a part of their tuition, sort of a tuition package, if you will. And then they get all of their texts included with the price of education. That is something that bookstore companies would like, because that means that they get 100% sale on the students who come. And they know that everybody's going to buy them, right? And that we're going to pay for it, because it's usually the college that would pay for it. So then we would then turn around and have an additional tuition charge or additional student charge based on a book fee, if you will. This is something that you need to just have in the back of your head, because it's coming. Just to give you some context of it, so our tuition is a little under $100 per unit for an in-state student. That course materials cost, if it was evenly split up among our students, it would be about $22 per unit. So you're talking about a 20+% increase to tuition. But the pros are the students all get the materials as part of the package. So that's something that is on the horizon. It's something that we will likely have a conversation about. Obviously, what we want to do is more and more of the open educational resources. So there's just something to think about. Let's just go now into the nitty-gritty. I know we provided these materials to you. I want to just remind you that $1 increase in tuition is about $350,000. If it's student services fee or technology fee, because the students are slightly different, not every student gets charged for those supplemental fees. It's a little bit lower than that, but it's between $300,000 and $350,000. Property taxes, if we do levy neutral, so that is, we don't increase taxes, we will get about another $2 million. So that's a gain in revenue of $2 million. That's planned, that's very predictable, and we don't have to do anything to get that, right? So that if we increase the taxes by 2%, that would generate another $2.6 million. And then we still have more capacity to go up to our levy maximum. That would generate another $4 million. In terms of state aid, we don't expect any change in STEM funding. Operating aid, we got $2 million this last year. It was wonderful that we got that. It is not included in the baseline budget, so we would have to get another one-time, hopefully out of nowhere. I would say it's unlikely to happen. The state has budget issues this year. They are going to be looking to cut. I think it is extraordinarily unlikely that we will get that $2 million. So that was a one-time. It was too bad. I was hoping that it would get folded into the baseline budget. It was not. So The good news is that we didn't rely on that in the budget. We don't have operating expenses that are tied to that, so that's good. So we don't have to look at like, okay, what are we going to do? What do we have to cut because we lost that? But it was kind of hopeful news. We were hoping that it was going to continue. On the good news end of the spectrum, Prop 207 revenue continues to increase. That's the smart and safe, AKA marijuana money. So we're expecting in the next year to get another about $750,000 for that. Sales tax revenue, we think it'll be up about $400,000 over where we're currently budgeted. So quick and dirty of that is, this gets back to another question that Board Member McLean has asked. Okay, so we've got our, if we don't, and Board Member Taylor mentioned this at the last meeting, without increasing taxes, without increasing tuition, we're talking about our revenues will go up $2 million for property tax, just new properties, and it'll go up a little over $1 million for sales tax revenue. That's it. And now to get into the other end of the spectrum, the balancing side of the scale that is heavier than that. I already mentioned looking at the bottom part of this page, and ignore for the point right now. This is built on the idea of what typically happens at the college. So typical, historically normal tuition increases are $3 per credit hour. Property tax would typically go up 2%. So these are typical numbers, but let's do it in the other exercise of saying we don't increase property taxes, we don't increase the tuition rate. Looking at the expenditure side, I mentioned the structural problem where we would like to fold in $2 million for the co-curricular expenses. Contractual obligations, we're looking at typically go up about $1 million a year. Medical benefits typically go up another $1 million a year. So we're talking about a little over $3 million is what we have in increased revenues. I just exceeded them, and we haven't talked about compensation at all. Yes, Board Member
I just want to make a correction. You said that the state gave us $2 million for operating expenses. That was not the case. Okay? The money was there, and they didn't define it. They didn't define how it was going to be used. And my understanding was that they had wanted it to go to the students, for students' fees or whatever. But anyway, it did not come before the board that I can recall that we voted on using that money that way. So I would hope that in the future that is presented to us. Thank you.
Let me clarify a little bit, because we're not saying different things. When I say it was given for operating expenses, it was appropriated in the operating budget. And it was designated in the operating, if we got operating money from the state, it was in that category. Yeah, absolutely is. It's in the budget document. It was in the operating aid for Pima College, $2 million. We did talk with the board about that at the very tail end of the budget. That $2 million was allocated after we had already talked about the budget. So we said, okay, the money's coming in. We do not know if it's ongoing money. That money will come into the college. We know we're spending money on all of these great things. And that's essentially, so we did talk about it with the board. We didn't commit to it in the budget, though, because it came in after we had already talked about setting the priorities.
Okay, excuse me. Okay, so what you're telling me is that originally we wanted to spend that money that way, and we most likely needed it, and we didn't have the money. So should that not have come before the board when it was given to us, because it was after the fact?
The way that we discussed it was the money comes in. If we don't have it committed in operating expenses, essentially what it would do is it would go into it's unrestricted money. Because we have other things that we're doing and we are currently deficit spending because we're building buildings and so forth, what it does is it just means that our reserves are $2 million higher than they otherwise would have been, right? So that is the case.
And that's where it should have been, in my opinion.
Okay.
Do you mind if I just tag one real quick thing? I do appreciate our state legislators thinking about us.
For sure.
And I do know that it was, a bunch of them getting together and pushing their power and their weight around. And so I would like to reach out to them in the future, especially if these things do happen, to make sure that we do what they intended, even though it wasn't written in the appropriations, just so we always have them on our side. I think that would be good politics. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dave, sorry.
Yeah.
On this slide, just so I'm just making sure I understand this correctly. So if I'm going to say something and tell me if it's true or not, if I'm understanding this correctly. So what I'm seeing there is if we raise property taxes 2%, we raise tuition $3 per credit hour, we're still in the hole $1.5 million.
If there are some things that I hadn't gotten into, that also means that you give an additional year of experience, so that's $3 million. Increase adjunct faculty by about 0.5%. So it does these other things and adds another $500,000. So it does more than what I had just said, but not much. What it doesn't get to is, while it does do a year of experience, it doesn't address the issue that you have minimum increases, what we've done for people. If you don't get a year of experience, that there would be a minimum increase for those employees. It wouldn't provide funding for that. In addition, it's now a couple of years on with the class comp study, and it's getting on time where we need to take a look at market rates again and see if the market rates have gone up. It wouldn't provide any funding to be able to make those kinds of adjustments. So it basically bare minimum, right? The $3 tuition increase, 2%, gets you to sort of a bare minimum ongoing budget.
So then I'm trying to back the math out, because as you were saying before, going back to the what if we do nothing, right? So that would subtract 4.6 million and subtract 1.1, and then that
subtract 2.6 million. So you do get 2 million.
So if we do nothing,
let's just keep it simple. Revenues up about 3 million. Let's just be simple. You do nothing, revenues go up 3 million. Everything else looks the same though on the bottom.
Okay, so what does the net change look like if we do nothing?
So then if you keep all of these expense increases, it's negative 5 million.
Thank you.
Okay, ongoing challenges. We've talked about all of these things. I'm going to just pass right through because, again, I want to get to a couple of other things. There are things that we can do. One of the things are that looking at positions. Let me back up. The way to balance, if you're not going to increase on the revenue side, the way to balance is that you have to cut expenses. The expenses that we can cut at this institution are non-operating expenses. The operating expense reductions that we can do, there are efficiencies we can find. I'm not saying you can't find some money. There's money to be found on the operating side. It's just relatively small. The majority of the expenses, if you're going to save money or you're going to reduce expenses, have to be through reductions in personnel. That's the unfortunate reality of the mess, or of our model. It's just the reality of the model. I do want to back up because there's one thing also that I wanted to say with the tuition. Okay, this came up before I was up. There are two things that came up that are worth mentioning. Adding full-time faculty to compensate for and having that funded by tuition does not work. Tuition covers essentially an adjunct faculty. So if you add a class, it's taught by an adjunct faculty. The tuition generated by the students in that class roughly covered just the cost of that adjunct faculty member. It would not cover the cost of a full-time. So when you're talking about the model of, well, just add full-time faculty because you've got the enrollments, the tuition we charge does not generate sufficient money on its own to cover full-time faculty. That's where like 2/3, 3/4 roughly of the operating expenses are covered by property taxes. So that's the subsidy. The subsidy is coming from property taxes. So when we're talking about shifting resources, which is really a critical element of what we're doing, is as programs start declining, you're shifting resources, finding ways to shift resources to the programs that are growing or have future potential. So when they said that adding the 3 faculty members for the CIS program, those are being reallocated from vacant faculty positions that were in other areas, and no one, by the way, likes that conversation because everyone thinks their program still needs another full-time faculty. But the reality is that we've got to, and we have mechanisms to do it, it's just a little bit slow. It's a little bit of a delayed effect that you have a program growing, and then then you start seeing, okay, now we need to add a full-time faculty in for those programs. The one component to it that we can look into and have more discussion with in the early spring, I'd be happy to have a bit of a conversation with the board, is the idea of looking at tuition for high-cost programs. We have tuition differential for high-cost programs. If you think about CIS, if it's not currently, it will eventually be what we call a high-cost program. We have a mechanism for identifying if they're a certain level above the average cost so it's the cost of the program divided by the FTSE. And we have mechanisms, if it's above 2 times what the average is, that's a high cost differential, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a mechanism we have in place. It does not cover the costs of high cost programs. It's just additional revenue that helps offset those costs. That could be a conversation. So one of them is looking at the programs that are high-cost programs that lead to the differential. Another one is having a conversation about should that differential be increased. And that's different from just the standard $1 of tuition, because you're talking about it hits a smaller number of students, it's more targeted, but it tends to be for the programs that are particularly expensive and that typically have better wage returns on the back end as well, and that tend to be on higher demand.
I have a question on and forgive me if this comes from a place of understanding. So and maybe this is just a difference between community colleges and universities, but I say at universities all the time that somebody is the Dave B. department chair of blah, 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 because like that is somehow endowed by a private donor and that helps fund that position. Do we do anything like that to help bring in faculty?
There's always the desire and there's an attempt to get that kind of funding. It is difficult to get that kind of funding at a community college. I would love to get operating support coming through big donations through the foundation. We've been more successful in recent years than in prior years in terms of support, funding, program support through the foundation. Big increases over time. But the idea of getting endowed fellowships or endowed chairs would be amazing for us and is very difficult to get people to do that.
Dr. B, Marcy's right here. She can address that.
Thank you. So thank you, Board of Governors, Interim Chancellor. We have one donor who has provided that kind of support for 2 programs specifically. It is not endowed. Their choice was not to endow the 2 department chairs. One is for advanced manufacturing and one is for aviation. It has a time horizon on it for 10 years. We are in year 3, I believe, for both of those. And once that has been exhausted, then those positions would not have that additional support to them. We would love to be able to do that for a lot more people. Community colleges don't tend to have those. There are some rare cases, but we certainly would be excited to be able to provide that kind of additional support to department chairs.
Marcy, have you had any, because a lot of these programs we're talking about are workforce-related initiatives, right? And so we have relationships with a lot of different companies and things like that, but at this point we haven't seen a lot of capacity among some of those partners to be interested in funding faculty or others to increase.
So we've had a lot of success with a number of the workforce development programs. Most of those programs, and I have to defer to other people in the room, but the programs that we have that are funding workforce are funding the faculty that are teaching the courses for the students. So they're non-credit on the Pima side, but the funds that we have are paying for the students' tuition directly to the college. Is that a correct way of saying that?
Yes. Funding scholarships for those non-credit masters.
So whatever it costs, and the workforce team says the student is eligible, then that money is transferred to cover the cost of that student's program. We have a good number of people who are doing that kind of support. It's not necessarily an endowed chair or something of that nature.
So in terms of what Dave just said a second ago, though, that tuition only covers a portion of what it is. So really, they're only covering a portion of what the college's actual cost is. Is that accurate? Did I?
Yeah, well,
okay.
so what the community college here, and this is typical of community colleges, support for students' scholarships is typically what we have been successful in getting programs. What that does is it provides support for the student. It doesn't affect the college's budget per se. It just helps the student be able to afford the college. So it's very appealing for someone to give that kind of a gift. It doesn't help the college's operational structure. And to give you some context about an endowed chair, just to give, like, to throw a ballpark. So easily $100,000 a year of operating expenses would be a typical endowed chair, say, at the college. Divide that by 5% is what you're talking about. The gift needs to be in the neighborhood of $2.5 million. It's a big gift to get an ongoing endowed chair that would support operating things at the college. And so it's a big lift. It's a big ask. It would be fantastic. It would help us immensely, though, if we could get that.
Dr. B? Oh, I have another question. So if you do get any kind of endowment money, do you take that off our operating expenses or our personnel? How do you?
No,
how do you identify that?
The expenses would stay on the college, but we would have revenues that would offset them. So we have revenues coming in, gift revenues that come in. We do budget for that. It's just in the big picture, it's very small. It almost doesn't show up, but it's a revenue that comes in. We do factor that in when we budget. Okay, let's get to the sort of the end. This is some information that, again, we wanted to provide to the board. We've talked about how the college structure, when you're talking about personnel, by any metric, the college is heavily staffed. Again, it's because mostly we had a period of time where we reduced staff effectively. We had a 3-year plan where we reduced about 200 positions. Other than that, the college is either flat or grows on the student side, and then you know what has happened on the enrollment side. So you've had a situation where the ratio of staff to students has gotten worse over time. This is a comparison of iPads with 321 institutions based on, and this is all iPads information. It's not state information, so it's not going to tie directly to other things that we've talked about, but it's very close. The enrollment in there we're the 39th largest in that sample of colleges, but then the number of employees we have is the 17th largest. And if you break it down and you start doing ratios of them, what it really points out is on the staff side. It's not on the full-time instruction. It's not on the management positions, and that's where you can see that down below. I can give you additional information that gets way more into the, way into the weeds, way into the details on this. And if the board wants to see more of that information, I'd be happy to show that. This kind of gives you a high-level summary. The real issue is that we have a lot of staff in comparison to the enrollment that we have. That's our structural challenge as a college. Our budgetary structural challenge is that we are very heavily staffed. There's some reasons for it, by the way. It doesn't mean we're bad. It doesn't mean that we're excessive. There are some things where we are always, because of the inefficiency of the structure, one, we have a lot of campuses. As long as we have as many campuses as we have, we're going to be a bit inefficient in terms of staffing, because you have to have some number of people who are greeters, and you have, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of see how that would happen. The other inefficiency that happens is that in our model, because we are a standalone district and we're responsible for doing almost everything from an operating standpoint on our own. We run our own benefits program, we run our own IT program, we run all of our HR and support programs, finances, all of that stuff. There are some states where the community college would just be using a state system. We don't have that luxury. That would mean that we would have fewer staff. And so that's always one of those things to also factor in when you're looking at some of these ratios. We will always be a little bit on the high side, but we're really on the high side. And so it's time, if our enrollment is stabilizing where it's at, which it appears to be, The only thing I think that, in my personal opinion, that's going to lead to big enrollment increases would be things like the economy tanks. So we don't want that to happen, but there would be something where students could turn around and come to us, or we have a big problem down the street, which may be happening, meaning at the U of A. So that if they're unable to provide support, we need to sort of see that that might create some opportunity for us to provide support for students if they dramatically cut the courses that they're offering. If they do big budget reductions, I don't think they're going to do this, but if they did, and it was hard for students to be able to graduate in 4 years because they can't get the classes there, we might have an opportunity. So those are things that we need to be thinking about. We are doing things. Nick mentioned a couple of things. Looking at inefficiencies and efficiencies, I mentioned that operating expenses isn't where we're going to find big pockets of money. However, that doesn't mean that we have an exercise underway already where each unit is being asked to take a look at inefficiencies that are happening. So are there things in the unit where you can cut down how much you're spending on X, Y, or Z? Problem is that a lot of those ideas they're drops in the bucket in the big picture, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still do a lot of those things. So we're looking at efficiencies. We're also looking at budget to actual expenditure. So looking at all of the units, who chronically or tends to underspend their budget and take that money back from a budget standpoint so that we can reallocate that. So we're doing that more actively. We've done it off and on over the years, and we're doing that actively this year. And then again, doing through position allocation, reallocation, moving positions from areas where they're not needed, identifying what we need, what we can and need to stop doing. And that sometimes means that we're not providing the same level of service that some people might want us to do. I can tell you it used to be expected that we had cashiering open at all locations for all hours that we were open. Over time, online payments have grown to be the great majority of all payments that happen at the college. So that justifying having cashiering at all locations at all times is not warranted. So it's like, okay, let's feed that, pull those people back, have them do different things, move them in other areas, or reduce the positions through attrition when possible. Those kinds of things have to be more aggressively looked at over time. One of the things, and the last bits, I'm not going to get into that today. I don't think I need to. I just wanted to explain this one. This is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity we have to be really smart about how we think about it. Traditionally, historically, people at the institution retire at or around when they're 65. It's not 100%, right? It's not required, and it's not like there's nothing that triggers it. It's just people tend to, and there's a reason why 65 is really the magic number. Board Chair Murillo might remember the magic number is something that employees talk about. The magic number is when you're retirement eligible with the state system. That doesn't tend to be when people retire at the college. People tend to retire at or around when they're 65. If you look at the trend, it's a bell curve for age with the college, and then it drops off around 65. People retire before 65, but that's the point. The reason for that is because that's when people become Medicare eligible. So there's a reason that 65 tends to be kind of a more magic, more real number. So what this means is that this is just telling you in the next year, the next couple of years, how many folks at the college will be hitting 65. It doesn't mean these people will retire. It doesn't mean that we cannot incentivize retirement. So, that comes up all the time. We cannot create an incentive to retire. However, we can reasonably expect that around 108 positions will become vacant from retirement over the next couple of years. Now, those positions don't necessarily mean that it's strategic. They're not always where you need them to be. If you add up that total in terms of the salaries, it's about $8.2 million. If we were able to strategically think this through, and the board gave us some targets to do this, and say, okay, we want you to reduce by X number of positions, that we have flexibility every year through attrition. People leave the college, and you don't have to replace all of them. So the number at the bottom, just to give, this is more like just big picture, doesn't mean anything specific, but to give you big picture, that if we were successful in reducing half of the positions that we think might happen through natural means, retirements, that would save, and filled only half of them, right? So you're saying that half of those, well, we need to fill those. If we only fill half of them, that would translate into about $5.6 million a year. It's not insignificant. And then you say, and then in comparison to any efficiency we might find on the operating side, this is a far bigger number. So the idea is there will be opportunities through attrition or other things that we have to think about is that you go, okay, we have a lot of locations. If we close a location and we don't eliminate the positions that are tied to that location, it's not that much savings. Closing a campus might save you $500,000 to maybe at most $1 million a year. If you add the people, the positions, I don't want to make it about people. If you add the positions in, you're talking about more like $10 million. So that's just, again, it reinforces the point that the college's budget from a reduction standpoint has to be on the personnel side. And there are ways to do it that it's painful, it's difficult, but if we were going to right size and create a sustainable budget where we're able to give market-based increases, where we're able to keep up with that year of experience, where we're able to do some strategic reinvestment in building new programs, that sort of thing is going to require some expenditure reduction, and it's going to have to happen on the personnel side. I think I got through all of the points that I wanted to, and I do want to leave it open for you all to give some feedback.
I have one thing that I'd like you to consider and for the board to consider, and that is that what would the savings be if we closed the district office and we got moved to one of the campuses? I mean, we have a lot of extra space.
Yeah, so that's similar to what I just described, like the operating expenses, the utilities expenses and so forth. It's related to this particular location, similar to a campus. It's actually probably lower. So you're talking about we might save about $500,000. Now, if we sold it, we would get a one-time, and these are marketable buildings, there's no question about that. There would be a one-time inflow of revenues that would help reserves, but it's not going to support you in terms of operating expenses. And then when you talk about, well, what's at district office, can you have other people absorb if you're talking about, well, eliminate the positions, again, because that's how you would save the money. The positions at district office, we would have to move them somewhere else, but the jobs have to be done. So, and I'm not saying 100%. There are reductions that can happen everywhere too on the periphery, but it really wouldn't save that much money to sell this facility. It's not, and by the way, I'm not discouraging that. I think it's not a bad idea. It's just, it's not going to save a lot of money.
I'd like to say it's refreshing to hear you speak because not only are you giving us the numbers on what we've spent, what the revenues may be, but you also offer suggestions on how we can think about changing our paradigms. So I am very much appreciative of you coming up with, you could do this, you could do that, you could do this, which for all of us probably means that they're also thinking about something else. So thank you very much for doing that. Some questions before I make a statement about the budget. The budget figure you gave us, I added up $5.5 million for staff in the budget projection. Did I get that wrong?
Well, you may have. I just don't know what you're including.
Let me.
So my puzzling is not questioning that you're right or wrong. I'm just not sure what you're adding.
It's slide 10.
Is that the slide that you're talking about?
Slide 10, $1 million for contracts, $1 million for medical, and $3 million for years of experience, and $500,000 for adjunct faculty. That's $5.5 million.
The only difference, I would take out contracts. Those are operating contracts. So increases for operating contracts, not personnel contracts.
So $4.5 million.
Yeah, so $4.5 million. And then if you were to add any other minimum increase for those who don't get a year of experience or other market adjustments, those would be above that. Yeah.
So bare bones, this would be $4.5 million for employees costs.
Correct.
And that's the biggest portion of that entire budget projection.
Right.
So everybody needs to hear that. That's our biggest pot of money.
Yep.
When it comes to expenditures and potential budgets. On a yearly basis, what's our average amount of money we put into cash reserves?
Historically, it would be on average 10 to 15.
So we take $15 million out of our budget to put in cash reserves so we can build buildings?
I wouldn't say it that way. At the end of the year, on average, going back in time, we have typically had a reserve, a positive balance of $10 to $15 million. You could say it like you said it. I would say it, well, but different things could have happened that year that would have resulted in the budget being spent up. And so it wasn't that we planned to we didn't budget to have a surplus of $10 to $15 million. And but your point would be, well, there's clearly has been budgeted cushion over time. Agree, it's not anywhere near what it used to be. The cushion is not what it used to be.
Could you cut closer to the bone if we put a moratorium on building?
The issue that we have, so getting back to, and this was actually, I meant to mention this when we were talking about spending down our reserves. So the buildings that we're talking about that we're looking to continue doing, finish up the Allied Health, and then the ST West building. And then after that, anything beyond that is we've got to figure out where the money's coming from. So then the other problem that we have to factor in is we probably, and we do when we're talking about the budget, we do it in a little bit of a backwards way, but funding up deferred maintenance and depreciation.
So you kind of made my point in one regard that it's really nice to have new programs and new buildings and go in and remodel, but people need to understand ultimately that comes out of the budget, which goes towards staffing and salary increases.
There are some additional costs that are associated with it, for sure.
But generally speaking,
yeah,
that money that could be in the regular operating budget is put into reserves, which is being built for building construction and remodeling.
It has been used for that, yes. Again, I wouldn't say the budget as it is structured now, that I don't think you're likely to see the $10 to $15 million surpluses in coming years.
Okay,
we're tighter than that.
So with that said, then we have to be careful how we're going to continue to build and remodel if we're not replenishing the building reserves funds at the rate we have in the past.
Absolutely, and that's where you get into that target level, right? That when we come back next year and I have to come back and say, okay, we're below that 75% level, what's the plan to get there? And the plan to get there then has to have budget surpluses built in. And how are we going to do that?
Which should be a line item in the budget as it relates to medical benefits, salary increases, steps,
right?
All those kinds of things.
It would be.
So the decision would have to be either or a combination of both.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to make a point here that they're not pots of money. There is one pot of money that we choose to spend in different ways.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So if you want a new bright and shiny new program with a new building, it comes out of usually somebody.
Right. There's a finite amount of resources and an infinite number of things that we all would want to do.
Thanks for agreeing with me on that.
I have one more question. I'm sorry.
You've been talking all night.
I'm sorry.
I waited.
Okay.
So to make it simple for me, if we have a flat enrollment or relatively flat enrollment, the only way that we can give, if the legislature maintains its current position, hopefully it won't go backwards, which is a possibility. If we have a relatively flat environment, the only way we can give staff increases is to reduce staff.
Or increase tuition or property taxes, and property taxes only up to a certain point.
Oh, okay, so that brings me to my statement. I have said before, and I'll reiterate it, that I am not in favor of setting a tuition in March without setting the tax rate at the same time, or at least having that amount of money in the budget that we talk about when we set tuition. They shouldn't be done at two different times. They have the same impact. They're generating revenue. And I feel like I'm being held hostage if we ignore the tax increase to balance the budget and we do it in June, whereas then we say, well, the budget is all set, now we have to raise the taxes. That's got to be done all at the same time. At least we have to hold that line so
Right.
we know what we're talking about.
And to be clear, historically, we typically have those discussions at the same time. I don't think we've maybe stated it as clearly as you're saying it. But the idea of, hey, here's how all of this balances to do what we're looking to do, and that would be, and that means that we increase tuition by $3 and we do the property tax at 2%. Even though we don't then go to the taxpayers for a couple of months, the idea would be that would have been discussed with the, here's how the budget is coming together.
So,
But we can make that absolutely more explicit. I
think
that's
it only
good.
makes sense to
Yeah.
do it that way. Because if we look at your incremental operating budget illustration back to page 10, if we're going to generate $8 million, $4.5 million of it impacting employees, it's going to be on either kids' tuition or property tax increases. That's
Absolutely.
about as simple as I can make the comment. So my conversation is going to be, do we raise taxes and raise the tuition rates for employee costs, or do we take the employee cost increases out of employees, or some combination thereof? I'm done.
Oh, one comment about we're not too vulnerable from the state penalizing us. The legislative process, there's very little money that they have that we actually are relying on in our operating budget now, right? If the university, I'd be worried. We are not in that situation.
However, in the past, when they've gotten in trouble, they've swept budgets. And they could come in and take our cash reserves.
They will talk about it, and that conversation has come up before. They don't have the access that they have with K-12s, but yes, the conversation comes up, and it's something we need to be attentive to. In fact, that is one of the reasons why we have spent down our reserves in the past, was worries about the state trying to. So at the time, what would be more likely to happen for the community colleges, how it would play out, is they would say, you have reserves above a certain amount, you don't need state revenues anymore. We're not going to give you appropriations. Well, they can still do that for some of the colleges. They don't give us appropriations. We had STEM funding, but it's very small. But back when that originally was happening in 2009, when that conversation was happening, that was a concern, because not only could they, the conversation was they're going to sweep reserves, more likely with the K-12s. But for us, it'd be more difficult for them to do it. But what they could do is what they did do, which is reduce our appropriations. And they did it over time. But now we're at a point where it's like, there's nothing there, right? We're not particularly vulnerable to that. It's for a bad reason, but it isn't the biggest worry, right?
So I have one question. You don't have to answer it now. What was the reserves in 2013?
A little bit lower than the 14 number? I mean, just to give you an idea. Yeah, so there, it's in your materials then.
So I appreciate that you dove into some of those savings that could be found with retirements. It troubles me now, and it troubled me since the beginning, that the college during this time when its enrollment has declined, and I'll say this frankly, but I mean it respectfully too, like I feel like you all have done the low-hanging fruit of controlling expenditures. Like you've done everything you can not to cut. And at some point, especially when you look at the ratio, I don't have the exact numbers, but like the ratio of staff, because that was the biggest thing in that pie chart, of staff to students in FY14 or 13 or 15 to now, I'm having a really hard time understanding how our enrollment could have been reduced as much as it had, and yet we need all of this staff. And I hear what you said about the fact that, you know, our model is somewhat inefficient in terms of our campuses, but then I also heard you say, but yet we're still so much higher than that. And so in terms of comments, I mean, I don't know, I'm of a similar thought process, I think, to what Wade was articulating, but I would love to see, as we go through this process, a version of those plannings where we, and this is what I sort of mean by dealing with what I feel like is an unsustainable cost structure that we've put ourselves in. It needs to be right-sized to where our enrollment is now, and then we can grow it into the future. But it seemed to me that we've had this philosophy where we've been like, well, if this thing may be around the corner or that thing may be around the corner and we're gonna tick back up, that hasn't happened. And I think it's time that we figure out how do we align this so that we are running this, given the inherent inefficiency of some of our models, and maybe we could have a discussion about locations and reducing those too. But to the point that's been raised a few times, and if it's the staff numbers that are the issue, I mean, is in my perspective and listening here, I mean, the, you know, faculty, adjunct faculty, the other ones, those are the folks that are teaching the courses that bring the enrollment, that bring the revenue. So that's sort of the revenue generating side. In order for me to support any increase in tuition or in taxes, I'm going to need to see a really solid justification that we need all of this staff infrastructure, and it's vital that all of those are there in order to be able to sustain it. Because I also feel like low-hanging fruit is not giving people raises. It's you can do that for so long and to kind of get through a limited period of time, but we've been doing it a really long time. Yeah. And at some point we got to say, look, this is not a sustainable cost structure for the college, and we have to redesign it so that it is. I don't know exactly what that looks like from numbers, but like I'm going to need to, if I'm going to vote for any increases, I'm going to need to see something significant or some really convincing justification for why this needs to be the staffing structure that we need to go forward.
Totally agree. I heard everything that you said. Don't disagree with the premise of it. Want to just add a little bit of color for the past. The college hasn't always done what you described. If you go back and you look at this period of time here, you see how that blue line is declining, the blue part? That is because we were in a situation where we were reducing positions. I mentioned that we reduced about 200 positions over that period of time. It was painful. We didn't do it. There were a small number of layoffs, less than 20 in total, but that isn't to say that it wasn't painful. That also at the same time had marginal salary increases because we were cutting. We had to cut expenses. We did it pretty dramatically or pretty effectively within the normal college way of thinking of it, which is minimize the pain. So we minimized the pain, but it isn't that we avoided pain altogether. And that's important. And this is why, one of the reasons why the historic drivers is actually important, because starting in fiscal year 09, we went through the fiscal crisis, our enrollments went through the roof, and our budgets were being cut. So the college has been absorbing challenges of different types for basically the last 15 years. And that's why you hear, well, we didn't give salary, which wasn't true. We did give salary increases. There were a couple of years where they were held flat. But it's where, and then you occasionally hear, well, we laid off a bunch of people. I said, well, we didn't. But we did reduce a lot of positions, and there was pain that happened. And the big issue is that enrollment has dropped so much that it's like you're just constantly playing catch up when you use that as your comparison metric. But you're right, if our enrollment is where it's at, and it looks like, again, barring some weird change that isn't under the college's control, barring that, our structure, we're overstaffed, and we've got to figure out how to reduce that. So agree with you in total principle, just wanted to give a little more historical context.
And I appreciate that, and I didn't mean to, it was a statement of frustration. I didn't mean to minimize what has been through, so I apologize for that. But I guess my point is just, I think it's time. It's time to do something significant. And honestly, it comes down to fairness, right? Like we're, at least me, I mean, I think all of us, we're here to try to figure out how do we fairly represent students and their families that pay into this system? How do we fairly represent taxpayers that pay into the system? And I don't think I could, in good conscience, ask them to continue to pay more for something that we all agree is not, it doesn't have to be like the model of efficiency, but that is wildly inefficient in terms of what we're asking them to pay for. It's just not fair to those folks that are paying into the system. And so, yeah, I would love to see a scenario where we really, and I don't know what that process looks like, if Interim Chancellor, how you would want to lead that process, or Dr. B, that really looks at what do we really need, and then he can give a really good justification for what that is, because I suspect that FTE count is lower than what we have right now. I mean, maybe not, but I suspect that it probably is. And at least for my part, I would certainly, I don't know if encourage is not the right word, but I would be willing to, have a conversation about the nature of that model. What does it make sense to have all these campuses? Does it make sense to have all these satellite locations? Does it make sense to have the separate district office? I think, as you said, those facility changes just in and of themselves aren't going to get us to where we want to be. It's a larger conversation that has to include FTE counts, but we should have that larger conversation, and I think now is the time to do it, because we may see enrollment increases. I hope we do. That's what our goal is, but I think they're going to be modest, and it's going to be a while to grow back there, and so we need to right-size ourselves to where we are, and then we can grow again into the future.
Thank you, Mr. B. Myself and Ms. Garcia have been here as well too, reference to the other budgets, and I think it's difficult and uncomfortable, but it has to be done. I know that a lot of the numbers out there are projections as well too, but we also need to consider, as Mr. Greg mentioned a while ago in reference to the families, I think I'm always supportive of the students, because some of the students that we all know that they have difficulty, not only their challenges in reference to their transportation, their housing, even having a good meal. But those are the areas that we need to look at as well too. But more important, one of the areas that I really would like to see again, I know that there was a phase where we eliminated quite a few courses, but we need to revisit that as well too. See what works and doesn't work, but I think maybe that could possibly maybe recruit more students as well too. But it's up to us, the five of us, but more important, it's up to the people as well too, to be formally knowledgeable in reference to what we're doing, and let them have the input as well too, because I think they're the one that elected us, all of us here, and trusted us to do the right decisions, but they also need to be informed reference to what will happen. Like I mentioned, these are projections, but we'll get through it somehow. Not only with the help of the community as well too, and students, thank you, and staff.
Yeah.
Everybody, basically.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. So last year our budget was $367 million. And I'm assuming it's going to be up this year because everything costs more money, and
It might be down a little bit because, remember, the big chunks that are in construction, and it really is the time flow of when we're finishing up buildings, the advanced manufacturing, the tail end costs of advanced manufacturing and allied health. Those are bigger than the changes you're talking about in the operating side. So it might go down a little bit.
Okay.
It won't go up a lot.
okay. So, I know Dr. McLean always tells me that I have sticker shock and I'm naive about this kind of stuff, but it seems to me that if, for short $5 million in a $367 million budget, we can't figure out where $5 million is maybe not spent to the best of its capacity, or, so I would just like to make sure that we do this the right way, looking at the numbers, looking at, where we need to spend money. And then the other thing that I'm really concerned about is, I know when I was a faculty member, we closed campuses during summer school because it was going to save money. and it did not save any money at all, they determined after the fact. And not only did it not save any money, but it also caused students to lose that ability to persist and, all of those, semester to semester, because their classes, I mean, the first time it happened, we were told 6 weeks in advance, right? So whatever we do, if we start thinking about closing campuses or closing the district office, I will need to see that it's actually going to be, a cost savings to us, because if it doesn't do anything to make the numbers better, when you close a campus, Desert Vista or the East Campus, basically what you're doing is you're telling all of those students that live in those areas that they don't have a nearby community college to attend. They might as well go to the U of A, right? Because it's, going to the U of A is going to be closer than going to any of the other campuses. So I just want to make sure that if we do anything like that, that it's data driven and not just willy-nilly, let's close campuses to save money. Thank you. Phew, that was a long meeting, and we're not done yet. Okay, thank you, Dr. B, for that presentation. Appreciate you answering all of our questions. We are going now to, do I have a motion to move to executive session?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Now, my guess is that y'all don't need to stay, because are we gonna have come back to make votes?
I think we could.
So we could be coming back to make a vote or two. So I guess Guadalajara Grill, have a little appetizer and come back. And anyway, please, I don't know if I can say that they don't have to stay, but it's when we return, it's going to be for a 2-minute vote if we have one. So I would assume that you all have families and other responsibilities that you'd like to do. So I'm going to say
It's up to you.
thank you.